going to start off with a question for each of you. Can you describe what exactly your role is within your city? And yeah, what does it entail? We'll start with Marta.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, most of us have been seeing each other for the last couple of days, and some of you may have already heard this. At the City of LA, I'm both the founding director for the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office and the founding Chief Heat Officer. What unites those roles is that heat is our primary or most dangerous climate hazard for the City of Los Angeles. So it became clear, I think, to the City Council that the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office that really just dealt with climate emergencies should also deal with the issues of extreme heat, because the level of mortality and emergency room visits, particularly 20 and 21, was so excessive, and it was actually the media that was able to track those mortality rates and ER visits, that was just so unacceptable. So then I realized it wasn't just about climate or pollution, but it was about public health and public safety. So we try to really collaborate and unsilo the work of climate and climate emergencies and create coordination and collaboration. And we're just now working on our very first heat action and resilience plan. That should be done in March, but of course that's the interdepartmental, interagency effort. And it's both exciting, but also very challenging to coordinate on all of the issues that intersect with extreme heat at the City of LA, and align all of our plans as well, not just the heat action plan, to ensure that we're maximizing those results and getting everybody on board so we can have good implementation.
Yeah, a lot of different departments that need to coordinate, I'm hearing. Dave, let's hear from you.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. Such an honor to be on panel with you and these other outstanding women leaders working in this space. Again, Dave Hundul at the City of Phoenix, and I work on a team called the Office of Heat Response and Mitigation, and the name of the office implies how we've interpreted our mission thus far as one that's twofold. Heat response programs, we interpret those as the short-term strategies that try to protect public health during the summer. Operation of cooling centers, for example, would come to mind there. And heat mitigation, long-term strategies to cool the city and make it more comfortable. And we're trying, as Marta said, to work with many internal and external partners to advance the city's work on both fronts. Something I learned just today, Marta's scope of work, her job duties, they are actually written down on paper, which I'm very, very jealous of. We don't have that yet in the City of Phoenix, and I'm wondering if we should. We are, I think all three of us, and people who work in our space as well, are still figuring out what these roles are and how they can best be successful. And a real tension we feel that I think we'll talk about a little bit. When are we policymakers? When are we strategizers? When are we think tankers? And when are we programmers? And when are we implementers? That's a balance we're still trying to find in Phoenix.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Anne, let's hear from you.
So unlike the other two rock stars we have on the stage, I wish I was just focused on heat 24/7. But unfortunately, I have kind of all hazards that could affect Jacksonville, environmental and otherwise. Jacksonville, just in the last couple months, has actually published its first resilience strategy, Resilient Jacksonville. It's available online, and encourage folks to look through it. Heat was a big component of how we thought about resilience for the city of Jacksonville. I think it's very obvious to folks in Florida that flooding is a huge threat that we face. And I think we have now opened the door for a conversation about what are the risks we're facing from extreme heat, the public health outcomes that my colleagues have mentioned, but also, you know, the tourism industry in Florida. If it is too hot, are people really going to Disney in the summer? Are they coming down and using our beaches in Jacksonville? You know, I think heat is really what's going to make people either want to live in Jacksonville or anywhere probably along the I-10 20 years from now, or want to live somewhere else. And so I think we have this opportunity to get ahead of these things. And I've been fortunate, you know, I've been at the city for 2.5 years, and there's a lot of data collection that went into our strategy. We've now had a mayoral transition and a recommitment to tackling resilience, which is fantastic, because I think resilience often gets a bit disrupted during political transitions, and we're fortunate that we have a lot of support. support. But the mayor of Jacksonville, the new mayor, has now also appointed a chief health officer. And we are really working in lockstep because at the end of the day, the reason to address climate, the reason to address heat is that people are in harm's way and their health is affected and their livelihoods. And if we want to have healthy, vibrant cities, then we really need to take a strong look at heat.
Yeah, thank you all so much. And I wonder if we can kind of dig into kind of the different ways you all think about extreme heat. Obviously, extreme heat touches all aspects of life, from, you know, acute kind of emergency, heat deaths, stuff like that, to kind of how it kind of insidiously impacts life. So I wonder if each of you could talk about the different ways you think about extreme heat and the different approaches you take to each of those different impacts. Marta.
Sure. Well, extreme heat obviously harms our infrastructure. But most municipalities don't look enough at the public health outcomes, right? So I really want to see and understand the health disparities across the region, have a baseline. Fortunately, California has one. We have the UCLA heat map, which is used across California. We're in conversations with LA County to see if they can make that like a longitudinal data set so that we can always compare to the previous 10 years that were documented in that UCLA heat study. Because I think, as my colleague said, health should be our priority. The health of the residents that live here needs to be at the top of that list. And if we can use ER visits and mortality rates and chronic illness during heat events as indicators, also mortality rates of infants and mothers during birth, I think all of those numbers are going to tell us a story of how our investments are making a difference, or if they're not, right? Because those are real numbers of the excess deaths and hospitalizations is a standard that epidemiologists use, and I think that that's what we need to begin to use for this issue. So that's just, you know, health, infrastructure, but also livability. As my colleague was saying, if LA isn't livable, if people can't walk the streets, if people can't take public transportation, live their lives normally, it's not going to be an economically thriving region. So we want to make sure that it continues to be an economically thriving, health thriving, and public transportation and overall infrastructure needs to be addressed. And we still don't have great estimates for the economic costs of all of that.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're starting with the data. Do you have any, before we move to Dave, do you have like maybe share a specific example of how you guys are working to change that?
Sure. Well, at the city, we obviously have an overwhelming number of data sets. We're working closely with the planning department and the emergency management department to create a dashboard using our climate vulnerability assessment. And I should say that I'm working closely with other departments to create a climate vulnerability assessment that's more granular to the city of Los Angeles. I'm also collaborating with EMD to create a local hazard mitigation plan that's more reflective of the climate hazards in Los Angeles. And it's the first time FEMA's requiring climate hazards to be reflected in those local hazard mitigation plans. So as you see, there's a lot of alignment that we need to do with data. And then I've had USC offer to do basically a dashboard for all the extreme heat impacts and mitigation measures that we will need in order to track our improvements over time and align it with our heat action plan. Right?
Great, thank you, Marta. Dave, tell me a little bit how you think through different heat impacts.
Yeah, I certainly agree with Marta. I think we've tried to prioritize health, and a number of different health data sets and health indicators factor into our seasonal planning and even our day-to-day response strategies. But for those who work with students or research groups, I think there's so much still to do, depending on which particular health data we look at from this past summer, the hottest on record in Phoenix and so many of your cities as well. Depending on which data set we pull and how we analyze it, the impacts of heat on public health this summer were somewhere between much, much worse than ever and not bad compared to the year before. We have that range of uncertainty when we're analyzing different authoritative and competent data sets. So I think much more work to do to synthesize all these data together and to understand the story they're telling. And Marta, just to steal some of your words from yesterday, I do like the very broad framing around health and quality of life, livability, My dear colleague Maggie Messerschmidt is in the room, who was a local heat action planning hero and leader in the Phoenix area for a number of years, and it still resonates with me to this day. I don't know if you remember this story, Maggie. We were at a community workshop in an elementary school gym or community center Saturday morning and asking people to share their stories about heat, their experiences. And this gentleman who was in the room was just so frustrated and so devastated and so sad. He couldn't get home from the grocery store on his bicycle before his ice cream would melt. And I don't know if we can fix that problem. I mean, it is hot in Phoenix some of the time, but this broad interpretation of health and quality of life, like that, like those are the stories that I think it's our job to work to change. Sometimes it'll show up as avoided 911 calls, avoided deaths, and sometimes there'll be people who are just a little happier with this little way that heat impacts their daily life.
Yeah, I'll echo everything you guys have already said, and maybe share the way my brain works, and because there's so many hazards beyond heat that I have to think about, I tend to try to bucket things, and I think we've heard a lot about the public health side of things, and from my perspective, we are also looking at during a high heat event, when there is a critical emergency, how are we showing up differently for our residents, extending hours of cooling centers, making them available, pools, splash pads, whatever it may be, to get people in places where they will be less vulnerable to fatalities or chronic illness from heat stressors. So that's kind of one bucket I think about. The other is, how are we actually physically cooling our built environment? And that's where you get a lot of the emphasis around what are we doing to plant trees or create cool roofs or green roofs or changing landscaping. And I think that's fantastic, but we also have to recognize the limitations of that, right? During a heat wave, you're not telling someone to leave their house and go sit under a tree because they'll be cooler, right? You're telling them to stay inside. So I think acknowledging that changing our built environment may not ever get us to the place where we can kind of neglect the emergency health response. And then kind of the third bucket I tend to think about is where are we gonna have critical infrastructure failure as a result of heat? And it's less frequent, but I think when London experienced that major heat wave two or three summers ago now, and they were having to wrap bridges because they were worried about bridges melting and tarmacs at the airport were melting, I get very concerned about where might we have grid failure or critical infrastructure failure. Jacksonville has 7 massive bridges that we rely on, and you could get stranded on one side of the river or the other. But we also have hundreds of small ones. So if heat is suddenly going to cause kind of critical infrastructure failures, that's something we need to know about. And so that's a way to kind of, I think, move beyond the kind of acute moment here and now, but it's something that I think folks in our roles have to be cognizant of, kind of the very extreme long term. And then I think one other piece I'd mention that doesn't maybe fall in any one bucket, but maybe is across all three, is really who's the most vulnerable, and that can be, your income level can determine your vulnerability, your previous underlying health conditions can be a vulnerability. We know that older people and young people are vulnerable, employees who have to work outside in the heat doing construction. So that's another way that we're trying to frame how we're talking about this and who we're talking to.
If I could just jump in, hearing the diversity of strategies and outcomes we're concerned about. For those in the room who have expertise in portfolio management or multi-objective optimization or whatever it might be called, I feel like that's where our community could use some help. There are so many different outcomes that we are asked to focus on, and I'm candidly not sure how close to optimal the city of Phoenix's portfolio is to addressing all of those different outcomes. This strategy might help protect road surfaces. This strategy help protects people. Maybe this does both or neither. And how much do we invest in which, and which do we put ahead? I think those are the questions that we're working on answering, but I think we could use a lot of help answering them as well.
Yeah, let's dig into those actual strategies that you have to use to deal with all these different heat impacts. I mean, we've talked a lot about, the inequitable impacts of heat, right? And we hear, when we talk about solutions to heat, we often hear a lot about urban forestry, trees, cooling centers. I wonder if each of you could kind of dig into a specific solution that you're focusing on, and maybe the limitations of those two main ones. And maybe we'll start on this side this time and go that way. So Anne, if you could start that one off.
Well, I think I'll kind of go with ones that I think are most unique to Jacksonville, because I think I'll probably echo a lot of what is said by Marta and Dave. But Jacksonville, for those who have not been, hopefully a year from now, everyone in the room will be able to say that they've been to Jacksonville. But if you've never been to Jacksonville, it's actually the largest city by land area in the continental U.S., larger than LA, larger than Houston by land area. We're a population of about 1 million, and only 40% of the land area in our city is currently developed, which leaves 60% on the table to develop. And we're really concerned, and a lot of what we focused on in our strategy was thinking through what the impacts would be on resilience of different land use decisions, and flooding dominates a lot of the analysis we did, but we also looked at heat, and if we are building out into areas that are currently densely forested to build low density subdivisions for single family housing, that's going to have a huge impact on what the heat profile of our city looks like. We've also really found through a local heat study that we did through a grant with NOAA that neighborhood parks are great, having a tree in your front yard, great, but we don't actually see the really major cooling benefits from that. That comes from having large swaths of undeveloped land that is kind of interspersed throughout our city. And so as we're starting to think about how do we accommodate over 500,000 new residents in the next 50 years, where are they going to live? We also have to think about how are we building and how might that change our heat profile. And of course, on top of that, we have the legacy of the 40% that is currently developed, and do we need more trees? Do we have to reverse the legacy of redlining? And are we trying to put cool roofs in our downtown? All of the kind of things that cities that are already built out have to think about. But I think one of Jacksonville's we have to always keep our eye on kind of stopping the bleeding. We can't let development continue unchecked and then have even more residents vulnerable to heat.
Yeah, thanks, Dave.
Yeah, such a big question you asked.
It is.
Yeah, I think in terms of what's moving the needle for outcomes that people care about in the heat world, I'd say that the city of Phoenix's work to add more shelter beds and affordable housing is the most impactful for reducing heat-associated deaths in Phoenix. And that is work that you might be picking up on is not led by the Office of Heat Response and Mitigation, but instead is led by housing, led by homeless solutions, these other teams highlighting the intersectionality of the issue. I will take the bait and answer the question from a tree perspective, though. To one, acknowledge the Inflation Reduction Act as delivering transformative investment to Phoenix in terms of $10 million through an urban and community forestry program that many other communities across the country have received as well. This is what people in Phoenix have been looking for decades. We have piles and piles of comments and surveys that are asking for this scale of investment. It is here now because of the Inflation Reduction Act, and our team will have the chance to help administer that in the city of Phoenix. What's been thanks to the federal administration, I think, is who deserves the applause there. And our partners at American Forests, who I understand were really instrumental in lobbying for those investments. What has our part been of administering that and administering some American Rescue Plan Act funding? The painstaking time that our teammates have had working with the city law and procurement departments to understand how to deliver these programs to community-based organizations and individual residents in a way that doesn't create a financial hardship or burden from them. Like it was very much like the behind the scenes. I can't believe we have to have a third meeting with the lawyer today to work on this one sentence of the contract, which, by the way, we've also now made available in Spanish, which the city has never done before for something like that. Like that has been, I think, the success of having the office and having the team, and it has not been the glamorous shining photo of the shovel going in the ground with the mayor, which we do love that as well, but it's been that administrative bureaucratic gear turning where I think the successes are happening.
Great. Thank you, Dave. Yeah, Marta.
Yeah, so for Los Angeles, I think everybody knows that there are many rental units without air conditioning. And even the ones that do have, people tend not to use them because they can't afford them. So a big challenge for LA is healthy, resilient housing. We have passed legislation for new building decarbonization, but have held off on existing building decarbonization because our office had a whole dedicated, really an entire year of having conversations with the community to see what could be the potential solutions and potential unintended consequences of requiring existing building decarbonization. So we wrote the Equitable Building Decarb Report, and that has spurred a lot of activity, many more reports. What are the things that this city must do? What are the best practices in order to require existing building decarbonization where there are a lot of affordable housing units, including HUD and HACLA facilities themselves, right? So I think it's a really important example where our office had some influence in engaging community to influence policy, both in a compromise. We can require it from new buildings, but let's think more about these existing buildings since we don't want more displacement. Dave's right. It's very intersectional with housing and homelessness or the unhoused. And we're very grateful for all of the facilities and departments at the City of LA who are helping the unhoused find shelter, but that's shorter term. Longer term, we need affordable, healthy housing for all. And it's not just about building decarbonization. It's about creating really resilient homes that are energy efficient, that can take advantage of solar rooftops. Right now, most of these existing buildings can't take advantage of solar rooftops because these are buildings and owners that can't afford retrofits to even accept a free solar rooftop, right? So those are the kinds of examples, I think, for larger cities like LA that we really need to dive deep into, but really engage communities. And in fact, I said this yesterday, but the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office wouldn't even exist if the environmental justice communities had not advocated for it. So I'm super grateful to the EJ community for advocating for us, and it's a primary goal of our office to continue that engagement, those conversations, and in multiple languages, and to provide materials and outreach through various mechanisms to make sure that the decision-making process at the City of LA reflects the actual needs of the community and the voices of the community, because too many times I think government as a whole has been so intent on creating fast solutions that we forget that sometimes you have to go slow to go fast. And we can talk a little bit more about that later, but I hope that helps.
Yeah,
I love that you brought all of that up, and it's funny because I think one of the best things about 10X and for me being on this panel is my ability to get to now pick Marta and Dave's brain. And literally just this morning, I was like, Dave, do you, during a session, unfortunately, I was like, do you guys have an ordinance for renters? And of course, he's able to send that to me right away. And so this idea that we're all, there are elements of heat and how we respond to it and how we show up differently for those vulnerable residents that resonate in whatever city you're in. And we're able to kind of piggyback and layer off of each other. And I think getting to the point where you're seeing the difference between, somebody who doesn't have quite enough money to turn on their air conditioning, how do we either get them weatherization or utility assistance, somebody who's unhoused, right? The first solution is we need to find a place indoors for them, and then renters, which don't necessarily have to be, income vulnerable, but often are at the liberty of a landlord who may or may not be willing to put in AC. And as of right now, Jacksonville has no way to know where those rentals are. But you better believe that's something we're going to look at, and it is really due to the fact that Los Angeles and Phoenix have really wrapped their heads around this, and all of these other cities, myself and others in the room, are really getting to benefit off of their leadership. So there's a lot of really great work going on, and I think how we show up differently for people is kind of a new function that is coming out of these huge changes that we're seeing.
Great, thank you all. Yeah, it sounds like a lot of different factors going into thinking about heat. And I wonder if you could actually share a little bit about, you, as chief heat officers, as resilience officers, you only have so much power within your own city, and there's a lot of coordinating across different departments. I wonder if you could each speak to kind of the challenges to actually implementing these great ideas. Is it funding? Is it coordination? Is it data collection across departments? Kind of walk me through what is the challenge to actually implementing all of these great ideas across the intersectional impacts of heat?
Yeah, I think I was just sharing with the other sustainability heat officers that there are studies out there now that 70% of the climate action plans in LA have failed, right? And the reason they failed is because they create these great plans, but they don't have a governance structure, an implementation system that the city agrees to that will stay there across mayors, across new administrations, because that's really key, right? So there are a few examples of best practices, San Francisco being one of them, I think Long Beach is another, where they had better implementation practices. And so we want to learn from that for heat as well. And I think collaboration is very important. So as Los Angeles explores having a more official climate action plan, because CMO my office has been asked to research the possibility of having a climate action plan. What what I think is most important is that governance structure for that climate action plan, and whether or not we should integrate the heat action plan into the climate action plan so that we're not creating extra work for other departments. And in fact, that's one of our models. I'm working with Maggie as well. She came to Los Angeles, an Arab, and we're creating a matrix, the RACI matrix. It's an accountability matrix where departments pretty much self-identify work they're already doing that have heat co-benefits, and they decide whether they're responsible, accountable, whether they should be consulted or informed. And we do this across departments, and that becomes then the buy-in, the collaboration, the coordination. And when they find out, we're not trying to create more work for them, but we're trying to really make it visible that they're doing this work, and also make it visible and transparent to the public, and make it more financeable, right? If we understand that this is already happening, and there's a heat co-benefit, and there's funding for heat at the federal, state, and philanthropic levels, then we can have better financing for these projects and actually get to the goals that we're seeking. So I really love the coordination and collaboration part of my job, but I also think it's the most challenging part of our work. But I'm glad that I love it so much, because it is really hard.
Thank you, Marta. Dave, let's hear from you.
I agree on the money standpoint in that we haven't valued the costs of heat thoroughly enough, and while there are some regional and national scale studies, I don't know that we've quite mapped out to whom those costs are falling to motivate them to be at the table, and that includes city operations as well. This summer we had the opportunity when the governor issued an extreme heat declaration in Arizona to possibly submit some receipts for reimbursement. And we didn't really have an infrastructure for tracking what the costs were that we were accumulating along the way. But I think I'd also add one to Marta's comment on the cross-departmental coordination. I suspect most people in the room wouldn't want to be told some version of, hey, I have an idea about how you could do 10% of your job differently than you're doing it right now. It seems like people are pretty happy with the strategies they have in place. And I think our positions are created to disrupt that. And programs have inertia, people have opinions, and people are proud of the way they're doing things. And if we're meant to change those, even by a small amount, the relationship building, some cases doing the work for others, and presenting it to them, I think that's an important part of our job as well.
Yeah, I would echo all of that, and I think being in a chief resilience officer role and having to, yes, worry about heat, but also worry about flooding, worry about are we setting up systems that are vulnerable to a cyber attack? Are we, how are we, learning from the pandemic and kind of thinking about that and how we do everything. So it's just you're having to think about so many different things, and really what I have kind of come to the conclusion is it's really, it's not a unique idea, but it's really truly about how every decision is made better and more holistically. And so what are the mechanisms that allow us to do that? And Jacksonville's really honed in on two. One is we have a $500 million capital improvement plan. Those are projects that are hitting the street right here, right now, and Public Works Department is kind of bidding out projects, thinking about them. Something as simple as repaving a road can have no resilience benefit, or it could have a huge resilience benefit. And what we're doing right now over the next year is we're actually working with Public Works to update our baseline design standards for how projects are built in our city and incorporate resilience into them. So if you're repaving a road as Public Works, how are we also now thinking about what material is that road and what implication might that have on heat or stormwater? What grade is it at? So how is stormwater draining quickly? Is there a bioswale that's maybe capturing some of that runoff? Filtering out pollutants, infiltrating, causing less localized flooding, but also that's, green landscaping, so is there a cooling benefit? Are we building in protected bike lanes? Are we painting those so that cars see them? Is that paint high reflective and therefore having less heat absorbed into our car? Thinking about these holistic designs and actually putting pen to paper and having your baseline specs be more creative. And I apologize to any engineer in the room, but I just, at this point, if you want your engineers to be creative, you have to make sure their specs are creative. And so we are just taking a step back, and instead of asking every engineer in our Public Works Department to deeply understand holistic planning and design, they're gonna just have to. They're just gonna open our regs, and they're gonna see, okay, this is how the city of Jacksonville needs roadways designed. And that's, I think, going to change how a lot of that $500 million capital improvement plan gets spent. The other kind of mechanism we're looking at is our land development regulations. And I mentioned earlier how much of Jacksonville's resilience work is going to be tied to where and how we build. But I think specifically for heat, we are looking at, how is every permit that's issued, just through the normal process it goes through, having to consider flooding, heat, these big environmental factors. Is this really what we want long term? And so yes, there's day-to-day coordination. There's a lot of trying to convince departments to really care about this. But I think the other piece is making sure that we're not asking them to do more with less. So as much as I'm talking about these updates, they're also gonna have to come with increased funding, more staff, and more capacity. And I think folks in our position often have to come to the table and say, take those concerns off the table. If this is truly the right path for our city, it's our jobs to actually, find solutions for those kind of capacity issues, so that the departments that actually, build and implement things can actually get to work.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you all so much. So before we open it up to questions, we definitely want to have questions from the crowd. I wonder if you guys, you've talked a lot about, talking across different departments within your own cities. There's obviously so much individual cities can do to deal with this, but I wonder if you could, and you've talked about federal funding that's come in that's extremely important. I wonder if you could speak to, obviously the climate crisis is happening now, extreme heat is happening now. Can you speak to kind of the role, what you would hope for the changing role in different levels of government from state to federal to local? What is needed to really put the urgency and what would you wish for, I guess, in kind of the changing roles in different levels of government? And I'll just open up to whoever wants to start that one.
I guess I'll just say that I wish I knew 2 years ago how IRA was going to be deployed and about the direct pay, so that 2 years ago we could have prepared the CBOs, the region, to have the systems in place to be able to absorb that funding more equitably. Because as we know, that kind of federal funding is easy for corporations. They've been doing this for a long time. But this direct pay program that is now available, and if you haven't heard of it, I recommend you look into it. It was created so that governments and CBOs can more easily access this federal funding. And so that's one thing I wish would have changed. On the other hand, I'm really grateful, for example, for this administration for creating that historic fund, and for Justice 40, and for the alignment at least at the California level with Justice 40, and the intent at the City of LA to create an equity index that will allow general managers in every department to have a baseline of equitable investments of their projects and infrastructures and services in the areas that have been most historically disinvested. We need to improve that program, but I still feel a lot of admiration for the effort that the city has put into ensuring that we have some level of metrics that then can better align with Justice 40. And all of this is in flux, and we're all making history together, everybody in this room. But in order to really have an impact, we need systems that work across the board for everyone. So,
Thanks,
yeah.
Marta.
In Phoenix and in Arizona, the governor's executive order last year seemed to have flipped a switch at multiple agencies at multiple levels of government, where the people who have been working on heat, we'll just say, is about the size of the audience in this room, and now there are 1,000 people lined up at the door ready to come in the room, and we are right now in the thick of figuring out how we're gonna reorganize the tables and chairs so that this coordination conversation is very active. But I do want to talk about the federal conversation for a little bit. Some of you might be aware that Congressman Gallego from Arizona introduced legislation to add extreme heat to the federal Stafford Act last year, and it's an open question what will happen with that legislation. Kelly Turner from UCLA and I were talking about this earlier, and I don't know that it's clear yet if the bottleneck to a better dialogue and exchange between local government and FEMA, if the bottleneck is on the federal side or the local side. I think it is very possible that the reason that FEMA has historically spent close to zero on explicit heat projects is that local governments haven't known how to ask for that money. And I think that might be learning ahead of us. A case can be made that the Stafford Act does already allow extreme heat to be funded. So more work to do there, but not let the federal agencies off the hook completely. I think we need to empower the heat leaders in federal agencies to mature the heat conversation even further. And I hope I'm not going to steal your thunder here. So yesterday we had the chance to meet with the chief resilience officers across the network, and we were playing with a data visualization tool from one of the wonderful creative leaders you saw earlier. We just happened to turn on FEMA's National Risk Index, then the heat component of it for Jacksonville. How many people think the National Risk Index for heat in Jacksonville said high risk, medium, low, zero?
It said
Zero is correct.
said
Zero is correct.
It is, I want to be very clear, 0 is not correct. 0 is not at all correct, but that's what this data set is telling us. And so, we have, sorry, I'll let you finish. No, but I think that's, this is what it sparked a really interest, and then Dave, of course, jumped into a rabbit hole of, well, what are the metrics that they're using, and the ways that, in Sunbelt cities we're reporting, a heat alert looks very different than other parts of the city, or other parts of the country. So you have areas that have less objective heat risk, but that will trigger indicators. So I think it's a warning that we need to be very intentional about the federal data sets that we use, and that also the federal government might not understand our local needs better than we do. And so how do we start to share that data up and down?
Yeah.
Where were you going with your rant? I jumped in when I heard 0.
I'll add here the eligibility maps in the state of California are also not granular enough. So we're definitely trying to have conversations at the state level and the federal level. So if anybody out in the crowd is an expert and knows how to advocate for changes in mapping and data at either the federal level or the state level, please talk to us. Because we have way more vulnerability than those maps indicate. And then that's the other thing. The metrics that they use are basically Landsat data and like air temperature data. And we want them to use vulnerability data. The actual outcomes of extreme heat in that region, in that city, because those are the costs that the families and the people and the cities have to deal with. And right now, vulnerability is a priority, but it is not reflected in these very important maps and data sets.
I'll just wrap up before handing it off to Ann formally. The National Risk Index is a really important building block for a lot of federal programs and investments. I think it's part of the CEDARS logic. And if that important building block says there's no heat in Jacksonville,
We have a problem.
we have a little bit of a problem.
Yeah. I'm gonna just put up a wall with that thought, because I could rant on that for a long time. But I think the one thing that came to mind with your question of kind of how are we working with state and federal actors better, in Florida, when there's a hurricane heading towards us, we know how to work very well with the state and with the federal government. We know how to work very well with our local utilities, our hospitals, our university systems, the Red Cross. We have just the most organized deployment of information and coordination. And we don't have any standards for how we activate our emergency operations center for extreme heat or extreme freeze events. That's a problem. We have, obviously, our emergency preparedness division will put out alerts when it's a high heat day. But if, we have conditions that could potentially have implications for our grid stability, we don't have a process for how our utility is alerting us to that, telling area hospitals that need continuity. We need to be just as savvy with temperature events as we are a hurricane, because we can see them coming. We need to have a way that we're getting information from the National Weather Service and immediately having that have implications for how we organize all of the different actors inside of government, outside of government, at all levels, to make sure that we're prepared for people. And I think we saw this with extreme freeze events that happened in Texas several years ago. I mean, there's always conversations about, will heat events cause blackouts, but just it's something that Jacksonville is hoping to get very invested in, and to just very slightly try to redeem FEMA. They did give us $1 million regional catastrophic preparedness grant to develop these standards. So, they are still a partner, but I think, we have to, I think for all federal agencies that we work with, there is a give and a take, and there's an appreciation for the funding that's going up, for the staff that want to be partners to us, and then also a need for us to say, hey, this doesn't work on the ground. There is heat risk in Jacksonville, and make sure that we keep those lines of communication open.
Yep.